Ridgeway here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the goal here is to understand some of the really big consequences that we get out of this event, as well as, for me personally, just also to help, because this is an event that many people have heard of and know about, to hopefully kind of make your thinking a little bit more complex and your understandings a little bit more complex. As you're doing the mini lesson, please feel free to stop this video at any time, and then that way you can take notes and reflect on your thinking and that kind of stuff. So as soon as you're ready, you can jump along with me. Our essential questions: how do human beings, such as you, fit into the global economy? And then, can people be in control even in the midst of enslavement? And part of my goal here today is try to convince you of something called agency, that even when things are really difficult and really rough, that Africans who have been enslaved are still managing to create communities and try to stay in control of their lives, at least to the greatest extent possible. So a little bit of recall before we get into the actual slave trade itself. Last block, we talked about the fact that Portugal and also a few other European powers have started to set up trading posts on the actual coast of Africa, and that these launching, these kind of like forts and stuff that they make are launching points for the slave trade. Now again, Portugal at first was looking for gold, but then they realized very quickly that there's a much quicker way to make money, and that is actually through the use of human enslavement. Okay, so if we go on, okay. The big thing that I want you to come out of this understanding is that the slave trade is one leg of a much smaller part of how the world economy is working at this time. And we call this the triangular trade. And so what it is, and you can see my mouse here, is it's this trade that happens between Europe down to Africa and then over to the quote unquote the New World. The thing that I want to make you especially aware of is kind of like how this triangle flows. So, for example, from Europe, okay, guns and other manufactured goods will get sold to Africa. Then, okay, Africans will be transported, especially to places like South America and the Caribbean, and some to North America. We'll talk more about the numbers that get sent to these particular places. And then what gets made in the colonies that Europeans are setting up are foodstuffs, and these are like agricultural products or different trade goods, and we'll give some examples of that later when we talk about the Columbian Exchange. Okay, but basically what is happening to African slaves is they're being put to work on these giant plantations, either in Brazil or the Caribbean or in North America, just generally. So here's what it looks like, very large. Okay, when again, you can kind of see that kind of triangular flow, which is how we get this name, the triangular trade. What I'd like you to do is then take a moment and think about how you fit into the global economy. Are there things that you buy or you consume that are from places that are not in the United States? Just give it a thought, and then when you got your answer, write it down. So one thing to note here, as we are getting to talk about African slavery, I want to make sure that we are taking a moment to make sure that this is as Afrocentric as possible. And that is, we don't want to talk about slavery from just the European point of view. So for example, we're not going to try to treat Africans as masses of people who've just been oppressed and we just kind of treat them as a group that, has no individuality. What we're going to try to convince you here is that they had agency, which is the capability of action. So African peoples did try to manipulate their environment and have control over their worlds. And hopefully you can kind of see that from some of the examples we're going to discuss here on the next few slides. All right. When Europeans arrived, African peoples generally, we're like lumping together 500 something different, plus ethno-linguistic groups, they just respond in a whole variety of ways. Some of them do willingly trade with Europeans, which does include slaves. Some Africans convert to Christianity or they blend it with their own religions. And then again, like some African groups, which we'll give an example here in a second, actually use Europeans to make themselves more powerful. And again, this does come at a cost, but there are just a whole litany of ways that Africans respond. It's not like a monolithic, like they were all enslaved kind of thing. So an example I want to give you of this is the Ashanti people. So the Ashanti are a really good example of one of the ways that Europeans use Africans, and in turn how Africans use Europeans. So something that they are participatory in is something called the gun slave cycle. So what the Ashanti people do is they court quite a bit of European trade, and the Ashanti kings become really, really rich off of this. But what happens is that they take basically the guns they buy from Europeans, they conquer their neighbors, and then they sell their neighbors into slavery, and they make money from that, which then they buy more guns, conquer more of their neighbors, and sell even more of them into slavery. And we call this the gun slave cycle. So this is something really, really good to make a note of on your notes, or even to draw it. I believe that I drew it for you on your notes, but always a good thing that you want to kind of try to make these kind of graphic organizers yourself. So right here on the globe, and I'll let you watch this on your own, is the Atlantic slave trade in 2 minutes. And there's a couple big themes that I want you to pick up after you watch it. So if you haven't watched it yet, go ahead and pause right now, click on the globe, watch it. So number one, there is a big theme with for example, like the time that things ramp up. And it's not really until like we get into the 16 and 1700s that the slave trade really gets out of control. Once then it's really like going, you can see that the vast majority of slaves are going to South America and the Caribbean, and there's only like a minority of slaves that are going up into places like the American South, or like like the middle colonies. I think there's kind of a misconception that because of America's really, really difficult history and continuing difficulty with race, that we think like, oh, most slaves went to North America, and that's simply not the case. The vast majority of slaves go to South America and the Caribbean, and then some to North America. However, let's talk about that middle passage and that journey. So if you were an African, again, broadly speaking here, the march to the coast was even more deadly than the journey inside the ships. So more die actually getting to the ships in the first place. But once they are captive inside of those ships, again, not willingly, it is hot, brutal, incredibly cramped. As it says there, 10 to 15% are going to die on the journey of the Middle Passage. And again, from the perspective of Europeans, like losing 10 to 15% of your property, as long as you're making millions on these slaves who are the ones who survive, you really don't care. But for African peoples who have been captured unwillingly, this is a horrifying experience where you don't speak the same language as the people around you. It's possible, but unlikely. It's oftentimes like you're laying in your own feces. It's hot, it's sweaty, it's cramped. You have no idea what's going on. But that all being said, there are ways that Africans, try to fight back, and that's definitely worth noting. The difficulty, I think, is that when we look at this event, 10 to 16 million, like notice the huge discrepancy in numbers there. Most of South America, when they get shipped over, is trying to find these examples and kind of highlight them that people did have agency. So for example, like many slaves committed suicide and jumped overboard rather than actually be sent somewhere unwillingly. Eventually, Europeans start installing things like suicide nets, which prevent them from jumping overboard. And also there's several examples of slaves actually overtaking Europeans or for example, other groups who own these slave ships, and then they actually fight and take them back. Again, the Middle Passage is a complicated and yet very, very painful chapter. Now, even in disruption, there is attempts by Africans to create community. So I want to give you one really cool example of this, and that's in Haiti, and also this happened in Africa itself too. And what happened there is we have something called religious syncretism. It's when we get religions start meshing together, and what happens is that Africans fuse ideas from Catholic Christianity, African polytheism, and then a few other different sources, and we get a new religion called Vodun, and that's voodoo, is probably what you more commonly know it as. Now, if you know anything about voodoo and you're like, oh, I'm thinking of voodoo dolls and that kind of stuff, it's not really that. It's a little bit more complicated. There definitely are spirits in voodoo, and the idea of like, charms and possession and stuff like that. But the big thing that you need to think about with voodoo is that it's a way that African slaves could try and could attempt to be in control of their worlds even though they were enslaved. Because what you could do is, for example, like if your master beat you senselessly every single day, you could, cast a curse on him that, he wouldn't have any children. Or if, for example, if one of your children had what many Western people in medicine would call like schizophrenia or something like that, you could cast out the demon that was perhaps causing problems. Because again, like many slaves lack, like the things of modern medicine. So what I've done down here is I've given you a link to a video of voodoo that's taking place in Haiti. It's really, really cool, and I highly encourage you to check it out. Again, with everything in this class, I'm not trying to convince you that one religion is the end all be all, but here I'm trying to show you that there's an example of it actually that we can pull from. It's really, really cool. So that's the end of this mini lesson. I hope it kind of gave you a chance to look at some of the big impacts and again, some of the more kind of complicated nature of the transatlantic slave trade. I'll see you next time.